Hi, everyone. It's Cohort 3, August 8th, and we're in our first discussion on Chapter 10. So, before we look to the text or any of the specific questions, would anyone like to just give any comments or thoughts on 10?
Hey Daniel, I'm pretty
Yeah.
I'm not prepared for chapter 10, so it's better probably I
Oh,
should leave. I'll read
oh,
later.
it's all
I'll
good.
join cohort 4 later.
Sounds
Okay.
good. Thank you.
Sorry
That's okay.
interruption,
No, it's all right.
bye bye.
Um, well, Chapter 10 has no figures or equations. It's a lot of synthesis and overview. Anyone want to give any comments, or we can like look over it and try to pull out some questions, pull out some thoughts? What do you think is the relevance of this quotation? In general, we are least aware of what our minds do best. Is that true?
I think we should first know what he mean about awareness,
What is awareness?
because we just supposed to this word, but we have so much different approach about awareness, about consciousness, about mind. Some philosopher they don't accept this assumption. They think this is we should just work with neuron and brain network neuron synapse and no extra work because nobody can exactly know what is awareness. We have different introduction about awareness.
Why would Minsky say this?
Means
It reminds me of the discussion of the transparent and opaque mental processes, where transparent mental processes are like air, like you see through them, which is to say you can't see them. Opaque, you can see them by virtue of them blocking the something of light. So it's kind of like the fish in the water doesn't know about the water. And so the processes that are transparent to us, the things that are the most routine, the most mundane, this at least quote is saying we're going to have the least awareness of these. I'm not fully sure because I believe there are certain things we are unaware of that our minds do well. But also I believe there are things our minds do well that we are aware of. So I don't know if the general claim can be said that we're least aware of what we do best. since I think there's things that we're aware of or not that we do well or not. But it's kind of a side point, but it's a, you know, as with all these quotes, they just start the chapter with kind of a fun, provocative declaration. All right, well, chapter 10 is a really interesting chapter. They wrap up active inference's main theoretical points. That's part 1, chapters 1 through 5, and the practical implementations, chapters 6 through 10. Then they connect the dots, abstract away from the specific active inference models discussed in previous chapters to focus on integrative aspects of the framework. All right. This is another spicy piece. Spicy and contentious. Does active inference provide a complete solution to the adaptive problems that sentient organisms have to solve? Is active inference a complete solution at all of anything? I mean, we can vote and decide, but what would be another way to say it, or how would people? Yeah, Esmail, please.
Yeah, you ask amazing question about this approach. I mean, active inference can solve everything, but if nobody know about future, but at least this optimistic approach is so better than we just suppose everything is like a mystery. With this assumption, we can order so much thing for research, and scientists and philosophers can research about that. But if we think everything is mystery, just we forbid people for researching, and in the end we can achieve anything. So my approach is optimistic about, but not in the moment. This will be long procedure, and future is open.
Great. Yeah. Treating things as a mystery, or somewhere on the mystery continuum, there with some amount of uncertainty, then it plus action. So let's figure it out. And then this is kind of like, do we think that we're on the path to achieving a solution to the adaptive problems that sentient organisms have to solve? Or is this going to be a fruitless path? I think we're through our actions, we're on the optimistic path. But I think this is a really, I mean, it's a bold claim. And the narrow interpretation is, did the textbook provide a complete solution? But that's a little too narrow. And I think the broader question, Esmail, that you point to is like, as a long-term field, will we have a scope of addressing adaptive problems that sentient organisms have to solve? I even think about it outside of sentient organisms, just to the adaptive problems that things have to solve, where some kinds of things are adaptive sentient organisms, but that's not all kinds of things. And then also, so that's big. However, the second part of the claim is a little bit clearer, and I think more supported. Active inference therefore offers a unified perspective on problems like, or phenomena like, perception, action selection, attention, and emotional regulation, which are usually treated in isolation in psychology and neuroscience. So I think that is a super strong claim that can be pointed to when people, well, what does it mean that it's a unifying theory of perception, cognition, and action? Or what does it mean that it's a first principles approach? It's like, well, if you go to a neuroscience conference, you're going to see totally different ontology, narratives, tools, documents, philosophies, on even just like the visual system, perception, action, selection, and attention. The models that are developed for visual perception, action, selection, and attention, those models may have no interoperability at all. Now, that's not to say that they can't be part of an integrated fabric of a pluralistic scientific account. So it's not like it doesn't matter if they're not unified, but this comes back to the neats and the scruffies. Do we want coherence within and across systems of interest? Or everybody has kind of like a level where they tap out and just say, no, that's like too much integration. But at least with these phenomena that they point to here, the book and the literature demonstrate that these different phenomena can be considered in an integrated model. Whereas approaches that don't start from a first principles position, in general, do not have that ability. Then they're going to connect to some established theory, and finally extend into some broader topics. Okay, wrapping up. Only 190 pages. Only 95 page flips away. 95 little epistemic actions. We're at the end of this little chapter of the journey. The book offers a systematic account of theoretical underpinnings and practical implementations of active inference. On these pages, they summarize the chapters. This is one reason why I think it may be helpful to have chapter 10 be read at the beginning, because they're going to summarize like really clearly what each chapter does. So chapter 1, that's an overview. Chapter 2, the low road, that's the how, Bayesian statistics and the generative modeling. Chapter 3 is the high road, the why, self-organization and persistence far from equilibrium, modeled through the Markov blanket. Chapter 4 gives formal details on active inference, focusing again on the generative model, and this time exploring it a little bit more fully in the context of variational inference. Chapter 5 gives 3 connected case studies from mammalian neuroscience and talks about how these different neural systems can be modeled with active inference, and then how once you model them separately with active inference, you can kind of stitch them together really nicely. Chapter 6 was the recipe for designing active inference models, a little bit of a playbook or a guidebook that also brings up a lot of different questions and considerations about scientific modeling. Chapter 7 and 8 were respectively about discrete and continuous time generative models. Chapter 9 was about active inference in the setting of model-based data analysis, giving a little bit of information about how you'd go about doing a data-based analysis, why you might do that, and what that looks like. And so in that way, it's kind of like chapter 6 about building the generative model, but chapter 9 is going to pull back another level and look at what do you do with data. 10.3, connecting the dots. Great. Dennett, So Dennett, decades ago, many decades ago, lamented that cognitive scientists devote too much effort to modeling isolated subsystems or even isolated phenomena. So not even just like, oh, the visual tract, but like visual perception in this one setting, whose boundaries are often arbitrary or even worse, disciplinary. He suggested to try instead modeling the whole iguana, a complete cognitive creature, perhaps a simple one, and an environmental niche for it to cope with. Esmail, what do you think about that, or what did the Dennett reference bring up for you?
Yeah, then it's always has Okamian erase. I mean, he always speaking about extra word. He first asked why you imagine, for example, consciousness. After that, you make for yourself problem, like philosophy zombie. I think all of you know what I mean from philosophy zombie. But he asked first you should you should suggest we have something name a consciousness. After that we can speak. Philosophy zombie doesn't have consciousness and everything like mind, like awareness. I told you the first of meeting. And we should just research about a specific experimental equation about mind, about brain, and even he denied phenomenal and epiphenomenal concept. I think his idea is so close to emergence. This thing you accounted like perception, sensation, and so on. All of them are kind of emergence. I mean, they different compared with neuron and brain, but base is just brain and neuron and not extra thing. And something we effect on the world and world effect on us, something like this. And we don't need, I'm agree with Dennett, we don't need so much extra word support, and after that we will fall in the problem.
Awesome. Yeah. Pretty cool how a lot of those topics like emergence and systems properties, which come from the natural sciences, then connect back to consciousness and awareness, like we discussed a little earlier. So benefits of active inference, next time you're at a party and, hanging out, relaxing. One benefit of active inference is that it offers a first principle account of the ways in which organisms solve their adaptive problems. So even beyond the theoretical unity of diverse cognitive phenomena, like perception, attention, and so on, a benefit of active inference is that it gives a normative approach, so not just an is, but actually an ought, and says this is how it should be modeled. I think it's easy to be startled by a normative approach because it can feel like impositional or constraining. But I think that's part of our interesting journey, is to understand what this normativity is, and what exactly is being, what ought to be what way. And I'm sure there's many ways to say it, but there's sort of some narrow oughts and some broader oughts. A narrow ought would be like, for solving a statistical problem with variational inference, variational free energy is the best that you're going to do. So that's like saying, if you're doing a linear regression, you ought to use the L2 sum of squares norm. But there's also kind of this broader, potentially less formalized normative stance, which is that one ought to extend from that narrow ought about variational free energy as the imperative for statistical modeling, and that you then ought to model specific cognitive processes, perception, action, attention, and emotion, as well as their mechanistic manifestations in a unified way. Now, someone else could say, well, I have a different normativity. I think that specific cognitive processes should be modeled in different and incommensurate ways. I guess that could be someone's normativity. Or somebody could say, I've never really thought about that. I don't think I have a strong prior, let alone a normative stance on whether things like should or shouldn't be integrated. But again, it's just an interesting topic, and how many times does normative come up in the book? 30 times. That's more times than you'll see normative outside of like a deontological ethics book. And here's what they explain right in the very beginning. Normative means there's some standard against which behavior can be scored. This is that narrower sense. Free energy, they're saying, ought to be the right quantity for perceptual modeling. But then there's this secondary ought, which is a little bit like, and so you ought to do things in a unified way. But that's a little bit less formal. But here's that normative level. Its central assumptions, all processes minimize variational free energy. So there's kind of this narrower piece. For a given statistical problem, VFE is the best estimator. And then there's this like slightly broader normativity, which is, and you ought to use VFE for everything, to the extent that they say that. The problems that things face, that organisms or other things face, can be described as inactive. They're related to action in the world. So that's very compatible with embodied, inactive, extended, encultured, etc., affective neuroscience and pragmatism. And also, the preferences are defined explicitly over observations. This connects to perceptual control theory, and also just not historically, by tethering our modeling to sensory data, that's kind of like where the rubber hits the road with not overfitting. Like, there's more that could be said there, but by making sure that variational free energy is a function of our beliefs and the real incoming data, that's a very strong check on not overfitting, not like proposing some auxiliary variable and then being super precise about the auxiliary variable, but then the actual empirical data we may be not modeling well. Again, more lists of cognitive phenomena. Pretty similar here. They insert looks like memory and intention. So kind of slowly mutating and expanding the list of cognitive phenomena. What can organisms do? They can change their belief, perception, learning, attention, internal states, or they can change the world. Action. Change your mind, change the world. 2 ways to reduce free energy. The third piece of the organism is the sensory data, but we keep our thumb off the scale. So the only 2 things that the organism can do is change its mind and change the world. Changing the world then changes the external states, and that has indirect effect on sensory data. They talk about memory. They talk about planning. Planning and memory can be understood as two sides of the same timeline. They have different in our just in our era of time going forward world. Of course, memory is different than planning because memory doesn't have the same causal impact on our action selection, but yet our memories can influence what we do. So it's not that they're without causal impact, but in both cases, whether it's reaching into the past with memory or reaching into the future with planning, we can consider that a deep temporal model. And deep temporal models, so that's how you synthesize memory with planning and situational awareness in the moment, deep temporal models. Now, we're going to bring in another level of the synthesis, which is, well, what is that deep temporal model about? Maybe that deep temporal model says it has something to do with interoception and emotion. So just there in a few sentences, that is a synthesis of past, present, and future, sensory exteroceptive, sensory interoceptive, and affective. So that's what they mean by what's enabled. And these kinds of relationships might be pointed to in another field of neuroscience or in another field. But if it came from neuroscience, it's unlikely to transfer to spaceships and computers and all these other systems. And whether it did or didn't transfer, it would be kind of descriptive and elusive, but it wouldn't have a formal basis like we know that active inference does. Again, they're just hammering the point home. We don't start by defining cognitive functions and try to puzzle piece them together. We start by what they characterize as the complete solution, or maybe we could modify the adjective and the noun like a comprehensive approach or a unified account. But we provide a complete solution to the problems that organisms have to solve, and then analyze those dynamics or fine-tune those dynamics to develop properties that remind us of cognitive functions. So like what this reminds me of is sequential dynamics. So this came up multiple times. So sequential dynamics have been modeled with the Locke-Volterra model. It's just a property of certain dynamical systems. It's not an a priori atomic cognitive function. But then that becomes deployed in a cognitive behavioral modeling setting to sequential actions like writing. So writing isn't some core canonical function, but properties from dynamical systems we can connect to their cognitive concordances. And all of these are maps, not territories. So, maybe there is some module in some system, but that's not necessarily even the best way to go about modeling it. This connects back to the whole iguana, as well as to, for example, J.F. Cloutier's work with robotics. Which mechanisms permit a living organism to perceive the world, remember it, and plan? So once you really think about what something needs to do and be to persist amidst uncertainty, the whole iguana, then even if you have a very coarse-grained picture of the whole iguana, like it's not atom level, here, it moves out of the sun when it's too hot, into the sun when it's too cold. That is getting closer to an understanding of the mechanisms that permit it to live, rather than infinite molecular description. those certainly are mechanisms, but they're not helping us understand from a cognitive perspective what's happening. Okay, with the normative perspective, we can reapproach analogies and trade-offs that have been identified in different systems. So exploration and exploitation. This paper it's actually a really nice one. Hills et al. 2015, I believe, has some representations of explore and exploit in body and in mind. So like come up with 10 words, you know, you go red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. Like that's kind of like exploiting colors. Or you can have like a divergent thinking, and similarly foraging. You could be exploiting one resource or exploring across resources. Understanding that in the context of active inference, which we explored a little bit in the epistemic rat in the maze, but it helps us rethink that explore exploit and how to model and approach it. So beyond the theoretical unity, we also get a bridge, a principled means of understanding corresponding neural computations. It offers a process theory that connects cognitive processing to expected neuronal dynamics. So you'll notice in the SPM package that a lot of the simulations, just as part of the default outputs, they include like dopaminergic signaling. And so that doesn't, you know, dopamine does multiple things, even in the mammalian brain, does multiple things in different organisms' brains. So it's not saying that's the one and only trace of dopamine. However, we can connect molecular mechanisms to statistical properties like surprise. Okay, now they're going to explore implications of ActInf for psychological functions, as if we were sketching a psychology textbook. So it's kind of like within the body of this textbook, there's the germ of another textbook. And they're going to highlight similarities and differences. Another reason why it may be relevant to read chapter 10 early. 10.4, predictive brains, predictive minds, predictive processing. We've talked about this a fair amount, but rather than a worldview in which sensory data come in and are processed and then make their way to their final internal representation and then are used to engage action, a sort of feed-forward model of perception and action, in active inference, inheriting from predictive processing, we have an ongoing generative model that is generating predictions, expectations, anticipations about sensory data and about action. And then incoming sensory data are able to be juxtaposed, as they say, to validate their hypotheses, predictive coding. And there's some subtlety with what's predictive coding, what's predictive processing, and so on. And then at a slower time scale, you have the model updating essentially its weights through learning. That imperative is self-evidencing. The best generative model is the one that's least surprised by incoming sensory data. That's the maximum model evidence. And so that is how this epistemic and pragmatic dual imperative is unified through action and active inference. Predictive processing. They write, the term predictive processing is used in a broader and less constrained sense compared to active inference. So again, probably a lot of things you could say, like active inference is predictive processing plus action, or Active inference is predictive processing with action under the free energy principle, but they're more alike than not, and predictive processing is the gateway drug. I mean, okay. Lots more debates and topics on that. Perception. Our perception is our generative model. Of course, we want to be careful with mapping the territory, but I always return to vision. We don't pay attention to our eye saccade. We don't notice our blind spot, literally. We fill it in. And we have high resolution color vision all around the eye, even though the retina doesn't support that. So for me, saccades, blind spot, and peripheral color vision give absolutely tangible evidence that our visual perception is generated and fine-tuned, not received. And likewise for other sensory modalities. That concept of perception as subconscious or subliminal inference is ancient, Helmholtz and before. Bayesian brain, again, another very closely allied topic with active inference. After all, we're talking about brains sometimes, and we're talking about Bayesian statistics. So how is active inference related to Bayesian brain? Well, Bayesian brain refers to a family of approaches that are not necessarily integrated and make different empirical predictions. It's kind of a broad family. It's not like one specific model, because it could also refer to a little bit more of a realist flavor. The brain does Bayesian computation, or a little bit more of an instrumentalist flavor. We use Bayesian statistics to model the brain, but in either, and also it can apply at different levels of explanation. But broadly, active inference is a Bayesian brain hypothesis, but it's not just about brains. And it's a process theory, not a hypothesis. But yes, it's Bayesian. It could be about the brain. But if you do Bayesian brain plus action under the FEP, I believe you also compose active inference. But active inference is more integrated, it's more normative, and it is better described as a process theory that's falsifiable, but that is very closely aligned with a hypothesis. They return to predictive coding, which was discovered as a video compression algorithm and only brought into the neurosciences most empirically in the late 90s. So it's only been 24 years since some of these things have even come onto the scene. Action. In active inference, action processing is analogous to perceptual processing. It's all part of the generative model. In chapter 5, we explored how top-down, descending set point predictions can then induce action. That's the equilibrium point hypothesis. There's another discussion of sensory attenuation. There was a box on that earlier in the book. It's kind of like the opposite of attention is attenuation. You know, turning it up is like more attention, turning it down is like attenuating. And there was discussion around how attenuation of our, so attenuating our attention to sensory input creates like, it opens up a space of the possible where then we can undertake an action selection and then lock in that precision. And that's exactly what happens with an eye saccade. That's why we don't perceive the eye saccade. High attention, fixed gaze, and then it's like we push on the clutch or pull off the gas, whether you drive automatic or manual. Move the eye, it's not noticed, it's not attended to, but of course it's still getting photons. And then once it's fixed again, we redeploy the attention. And so that's why our phenomenology of vision is basically fixed without and maybe some pathologies, maybe there's nausea. If there's a failure of that kind of attenuation, it might be very unsettling in the eye saccade setting. But in the bodily motor setting, this is where some people are challenged with beginning motion. So they can't step off the gas. So then their sensory inputs like, no, you're in a chair, you should just stay here. Or inability to stop motion. Idea motor, these are kind of broad conceptual theories that active inference brings a lot of rigor to, but they basically relate to mind and body. Actions are selected on the basis of their predicted consequences. Cybernetics, TOTE, test, operate, test, exit. We've also connected ActInf to OODA, observe, orient, decide, act. Perceptual control theory. We also have requisite diversity and good regulator theorem. Basically everything related to cybernetics, active inference is going to be able to handle. With this specific note that the preferences are over perceptions, which kind of grounds higher levels of the system. Optimal control theory. So the inbound perceptual and learning side of active inference, the cybernetic entity, that's like signal processing and sense making. The outgoing dependency on the Markov blanket is connected to control theory. Here's some discussions about control theory. Importantly, optimal motor control is kind of aligned with reward learning in that there's a cost or a value function. It uses these economic metaphors: cost, value, reward, utility. Whereas we use all the apparatus that we've described earlier. We don't need to invoke these economic metaphors or anything. But we can account for utility in decision-making. Here's the economic theories of utility maximization and reinforcement learning. We can account for those with pragmatic value. Dynamic programming, there's really cool modeling work that's using dynamic programming in active inference. When all people have is pragmatic value, utility, reward, then they have to propose these ad hoc strategies to get non-pragmatic behavior, or to escape local optima, like burn-in, novelty bonus, intrinsic reward, the list goes on. Active inference, we just specify it up front: expected free energy, epistemic plus pragmatic value. Rather than trying to find the most rewarding or the highest utility path, we try to find the most likely path. So instead of climbing to the mountain, top of the mountain, who knows if we're at the top of the mountain, we're taking the path of least action. And that's what connects all of these discussions to Bayesian mechanics. That's what makes it physics based, among other things, is that it's a variational principle of least action for cognitive systems. So just like a baseball with certain starting conditions and so on has a certain parabola, that's the path of least action, the Bayesian updating with a given prior and attention and incoming data stream is going to update a certain way on the path of least action. Now, that path of least action may also be described by the most rewarding trajectory or the highest utility trajectory or whatever. But it turns out that it's a lot more general and generic to describe it as taking a path of least action, which is something that physical systems do, rather than this kind of like aspirational highest utility approach. That's connected to decision making. Again, there's no utility or cost function in active inference. We select action plans based upon their probability of happening, not based upon their probability of providing a reward. And there's parameters like the shaky hand parameter or the temperature on decision making. If you turn the temperature to absolute 0, then you're going to select the action that you think is better, even if it's only a little bit better. Whereas if you have the shaky hand parameter very high temperature decision making, then you blur differences in the expected free energy of policies, and you basically select the policies at reinforcement learning. Policy is used differently. Model-based and model-free RL. And policy gradient methods, which are similar procedurally in certain ways to active inference. However, the objective function is different. It's a reward function that's being reinforced. It's not a generative model surprise bounding free energy explicitly. And there are some differences more. Planning. Behavior bounded rationality. This kind of connects to type 1, type 2 thinking. Deliberative, dual theory. Rational Kahneman. Free energy theory of bounded rationality. Valence emotion motivation. Now they're kind of exploring broader phenomena. Homeostasis, allostasis, interoceptive processing. Pretty cool that active inference is very flexible to describe visual input or packets coming over the network or interoception. Again, neats and scruffies. The neat wants to have a unifying model that can describe all those input-output systems or measurement control systems. The scruffy says, no, interoception is different than vision, and that's different than the computer packet. Attention, salience, epistemic dynamics. Attention is covert action. It's internal action, and it's modeled as such. Overt action is embodied action. We can operationally define attention as the precision associated with sensory input. If you're not paying attention, the sensory input doesn't matter in the sense that it doesn't update your model. In the limit of paying extreme attention, whatever data point comes in, you will update your beliefs to be that. That's related to gain control in the Bayesian setting, like in audio engineering. Salience is expected information gain. Salience is in terms of an action or policy, while attention is an attribute of beliefs about sensory input. Rule learning, causal inference, fast generalization. Great quote by Rumi. These are like half page to 1 page long, but there's there's so much here. And then ActInf and other fields, open directions. Sociocultural dynamics. We're exploring that a lot in the ongoing course, active inference for the social sciences, machine learning and robotics. Huge topic, a lot of work in this field. Are those the only two? Yeah. In summary, ending with a Tolkien Lord of the Rings quote, alluding to the golden ring on the cover of the textbook. We are now at the end of our journey. Their aim was to offer an introduction to those interested in using methods conceptually and formally. Did they do it? However, it is important to emphasize active inference is not something that can be learned purely in theory. We encourage anyone who has enjoyed this book to think about pursuing it in practice. Whether or not you pursue a computational practice, we hope you will reflect on it as you engage in active inference in day-to-day life. You might be looking to see something you're not sure what it is. It might be eating what you know you like, might be trying something new. Might be turning down the shower heat if it's too hot, might be not turning down the shower heat. Ultimately, we are confident that you will continue to pursue active inference in some form. That's the book. And then there's the appendices. Any kind of closing thoughts? Yeah, it's a long chapter, textual chapter, no figures, no equations. It's like a whole undergrad degree kind of compressed. So it covers a lot. I guess next week we can return to some of these discussions, bring up some of these notes into the questions, ask new questions. Cool. Any last comments? All right. Thank you all. See you next time.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.